All right, good afternoon, good Erev Shabbos. Hope you're doing well. We're going to do a Rashi from the end of the Parsha. Towards the end of the Parsha, we learn not only about the travels of Bnei Israel, the beginning of Masei, but also about various things that were going to happen once they enter Eretz Israel. This is the beginning of that process, including the designation of Arei Leviim, the cities of the Leviim, and Arei Miklat, cities of refuge, where a person who had committed an accidental murder or manslaughter, as we might call it today, would be able to run away and be protected from the wrath of the Gol Hadam, of the family who might want to avenge the blood of their relative, and also as a means of gaining kapara, of atonement for the act, which was a negligent act. It wasn't perhaps a purposeful murder, but a negligent act nonetheless, as the Torah here in our Parsha delineates, and other places as well. Some of the specifics of what's considered to be Rotzeach B'Shogeg versus Rotzeach B'Mezid, etc. Now, in terms of the designation of those cities, the Torah tells us, "V'harim asher titenu, sheish arei miklat yena lachem." There should be 6 cities of refuge in total in the territory of the land of Israel, in the territory of Bnei Israel. And the Torah says specifically where those will be. Et shlosh harim titnu me'evar le'Yarden, ve'et shlosh harim titnu be'eretz Canaan arei miklat tiena. Total of 6 arei miklat, 3 on the eastern side of the Yarden and 3 on the western side of the Yarden. I want to do 2 Rashis related to these arei miklat, both of which I think are interesting. Number one, there seems to be a redundancy in the psukim, the blue pasuk versus the yellow pasuk. If we know in Pasuk Yodalet that Shalosh Titnu Me'ever Liyarden and Shlosh Harim Titnu Be'eretz Canaan, 3 are going to be in the east and 3 are going to be in the west, we know that there's a total of 6. So why is it the Torah has to preface it by saying Harim Asher Titenu Sheish Arei Miklat Tiena Lachem, that there should be 6 cities of refuge? Why do we need a 6 introduction to a 3 plus 3 where the simple math would yield the same result? So Rashi explains over here that the reason why 6 are stated and then 3 and 3 is because Magid she'afa pi shehivdil Moshe b'chayav shalosh arim be'ever hayarden lo hayu kotos ad shenivchu shalosh shenatan Yehoshua be'eretz Canaan. In our parsha, we learned that Moshe, even though he's not going to enter the land of Israel, is the one to apportion the land to the tribes of Bnei Gad, Reuven, and Chatzi Shevet Menashe on the eastern side of the Yarden, and he is the one to designate the 3 Arei Miklat on the eastern side of the Yarden. However, the fact that the Torah prefaces it with 6 before the 3 plus 3, we learn that the 6 are a package deal. And that even though Moshe designated, he had the schus, the merit in his lifetime to designate these 3 Arei Miklat on the eastern side of the Yarden, they wouldn't work to absorb the Rotzeach B'Shogeg until all 6 had been designated, meaning until the other 3 had been designated by Yoshua. Once the final 3 are designated by Yoshua on the western side of the Yarden, then all 6 become active cities of refuge. So it's almost a caveat teaching us about the 6, telling us it's a package deal, is a caveat to the 3 and 3. It's a little bit of a caveat to Moshe's designation of these 3, telling us that they're not going to quite work yet. And one could imagine why that would be. Until they're all active and the whole system is in place, it would be harder to activate one versus the other. They kind of do all go together and they are strategically placed. Speaking about strategic placement, Rashi raises another interesting question about the geography of these Arei Miklat. And the Gemara actually goes into great detail about how they have to be equidistant from each other and how they're placed and where they're located, which raises a strange question for us. Afal pisha beretz Canaan tisha shvatim, v'kan einan ela shnayim, hishru minyan arei miklat shelahem. There's something strange going on here. If they're supposed to be equidistant so people can run to them from any given location in the entirety of the land of Israel, it's a little bit strange that for 9 tribes in the land of Israel, or 9.5 tribes in the land of Israel, there's only a total of 3 Arei Miklat in this gigantic territory. And yet on the eastern side of the Yarden, for just 2.5 tribes, we learned that there's also 3 Arei Miklat. Why is it the same amount of Arei Miklat for both different geographical locations, when in theory they should have been a lot more in the territory of the land of Israel and a lot less on the eastern side of the Yarden? And Rashi concludes here, Mishum de Begilad Nefishe Rotzchem, because not all territories are equal. In Gilad, the territory on the eastern side of the Yarden, there were many more murderers than in the land of Israel. There are many more killings than in the land of Israel proper, and therefore they needed more Ari Miklat on the eastern side, despite the smaller geographic location, despite the smaller number of Shvatim. They needed the same amount of Ari Miklat as the totality of territorial Israel on the western side of the Yarden. It's an interesting approach, and Rashi is not the first to initiate it. One still has to wonder at the end of the Rashi why it is at the root of it all, why it is that there are more murderers or more killings on the eastern side of the Yarden than on the west. And that's an open question. One imagines it almost like the Wild West a little bit, like, in this territory east of the Yarden, it wasn't the actual territory of Israel. It was a little more removed. It was a little farther out there. It was more a land of grazing. It's like the Wild West, like more things could happen over there. That's one explanation. But another explanation, which has always resonated with me, which I've always found meaningful, is that the centers of Jewish life, the centers of Torah, the centers of learning, the centers of role modeling, the center of all of our national life and religious life were in the territory to the west of the Yarden. And one might imagine that although we're talking here about accidental killings and negligence of some sort, one has to imagine that the further you are away from these centers of learning, from the centers of Torah, from the centers of the places that model our values, the more people are susceptible to falling prey to other courses of action, other modes of life, and other ways of being where they're not as careful about the things that we value. And that's a danger of living out of large centers of Jewish life. And I think it's something that I've always thought about as I've seen that explanation, the context of current life in America, certainly Jewish life in America. We see this kind of rush away from smaller Jewish communities that once existed to the bigger centers of Jewish life. And there are pros and cons to that. There's something nice about small town Jewish life and these small communities that had existed all over the country in various places. We were in New England before we came here, and there were so many communities all along, the corridor of New England, various small places, Massachusetts and Connecticut, all of which are now defunct. People have moved to bigger Jewish communities. There's something beautiful about living in those kinds of places, but I think part of the instinct that people have had in more recent years to move to bigger Jewish communities is hard. It's hard to sustain your values. It's hard to have yourselves and your kids just absorb by osmosis the values that you hold dear when you have less and less people around you who are espousing those values. And in some ways, I think that's perhaps the explanation that's being given to this Rashi over here. The people in Gilad, the people over there out in far-flung places east of the Yarden, they didn't see the same models of Jewish life as people who are closer by, which perhaps led to a greater negligence in terms of some of these issues that we hold to be important. Thank you, and have a great Shabbos, everyone.
Thank you, Rabbi.